Hey everybody, welcome back to psychology. I am actually excited to give this lesson for you guys. You are very fortunate because we are skipping way ahead. This is typically something I do like at the very end, right before everybody leaves. But I figured since pretty much physically you already all have left. So we're going to go ahead and do psychological disorders. Many of you may have noticed I am 4 days deep now into growing a quarantine mustache, and I think it looks good on me. It makes me feel like a better teacher. So today, I'm going to give you guys a PowerPoint over what is the psychological disorders. We're going to talk about ADHD and is that a psychological disorder and the insanity plea. Your homework is going to be, after you watch this video, to take a quiz and then to write just a little bit about the insanity plea and what your views on it are. Both those things are due on the 10th by noon. I've also included the page numbers for the sections that we're going through in the book. So if you want to read along, you're more than welcome to. So, big takeaways from today. We're going to look at how people judge if something is a psychological disorder or not. We're going to look at the difference between the medical model and the physiological model and like how people have viewed psychological disorders throughout the years. And we're going to look at what are the goals of the DSM-5. So this is a great example of a psychological disorder. I felt the need to clean my room. I would spend 4 or 5 hours at it. At the time, I loved doing it, and then I didn't want to do it anymore, but I couldn't stop. The clothes hung 2 fingers apart. I touched my bedroom wall before leaving the house. I had constant anxiety. I thought I might be nuts. That's a great example of a psychological disorder because it is pretty obvious. Like, you can look at that and be like, okay, that person has real issues, but what is causing them to do that? And people found this very interesting for a long time. Um, we think that they are so interesting, like for two main reasons. And these are not just like made up reasons, but it's actually just the way our brain works. Um, First off, we all feel abnormal at times. It is part of the deal. Everybody feels weird or crazy or thinks like they might be losing it or am I depressed or what's going on. We all have times when we feel like it. And so we're intrigued by learning more. Second, we are like our brains are physically drawn to bad news. And so when you see things that are abnormal, you can't help but be interested in them. So the World Health Organization says there's about 450 million people on Earth suffering from psychological disorders. It's actually up from that. That's old data. Um, the really interesting thing is that there's only two psychological disorders that exist in all cultures throughout the world. That's depression and schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, it's the same or has different like varieties throughout the world. But the reason why people get depressed changes through different cultures too. So even that's not exactly the same throughout cultures. So um, when you look at something and sees like, is that a psychological disorder? It has to be persistent. Second off, it has to have the three Ds. It has to be deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional. If it is not deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional, it does not count. So it has to be outside what is normal. Is it normal to clean your room? Yes. Is it normal to have all of your hangers 2 fingers apart and feel anxiety if you don't and like have to rub the walls and wash your hands and all of this stuff? No, that is deviant. Now, interestingly, it it goes by your culture. So in this African tribe, there's this celebration where the men get all dressed up and wear these goofy costumes to try and attract a mate. To us, that's weird. To them, that's normal. So that's not a psychological disorder because it's normal to them. It has to be distressful for the person. They have to not like it, which is often like what you see is people start off with liking whatever they've got, or at times like people with OCD are fine with it, and eventually it gets to the point where it's crippling to them, and that's when it really becomes a psychological disorder. On top of that, it has to be dysfunctional. It has to make it so you cannot function inside a society in a normal way. So again, if you paint your face and go to a football game or whatever, that is normal. That's actually a good thing. If you show up to class with your face painted, that makes you weird. And so you have to understand that there's different situations for everything. Like, is it normal to laugh and smile? Yes. Is it normal to be the person that laughs and smiles at a funeral or when somebody else gets hurt? No. And that's the type of thing that we're looking at and talking about. So, a good example of a psychological disorder is ADHD. Is ADHD real? Absolutely. But there's always this debate is if it's just kids being kids or some people more active and outgoing and should we be medicating people? And that's a great like example of how difficult it is to define psychological disorders because it's never night and day. It's never clear. It's hard to tell where somebody has ADHD and when somebody is just bored and acting out in class. And it's important that you realize this as we go through psychological disorders is like there's no switch where you can just like, shove a cotton swab up somebody's nose and see if they have the flu. Like there is no test like that for most psychological disorders. Psychological disorders have never really been understood until fairly recently, and even then, I'm sure that we'll look back in time and how we treated them and think it was crazy. The oldest way was to use something called trephination, is they would put a drill to your head and drill a hole in it. It was 100% effective in killing people in ancient times. They thought that it would free the devil or like the demon that was in your head. It was very, very good at scrambling your brains and thus killing you. It really wasn't until like the late 1700s, early 1800s that people started looking at psychological disorders and being like, something's not right here, and it's not the devil. There's got to be something medically wrong with them. And we call that the medical model. It focuses on like developing a diagnosis, like looking for symptoms, putting things together, just like we would any other disease. Today, we use the biopsychosocial approach. So we go in and we look and see like biologically, like what's their family history, physiologically, what's going on with them, culturally, like what's happened to them, why are they living the way that they are and feeling the way that they are. Um, Again, when you look at something and somebody, if I told you a story about like somebody freaks out once a month and starts crying for no reason and is sad and feels pain, like becomes depressed, you could sit there and say like, well, that maybe that person's bipolar. Well, my experience with my wife says like, no, she's menstruating. Like, and that's a difficult thing for us to understand. Like, you cannot just look at somebody and say, boom, or the situation or their symptoms and say, boom, boom, boom. There's a lot of things that go into it. Um, the DSM is the manual that they use to kind of write these definitions. There are over 400 different psychological disorders. Um, in the 50s, there were only 60. The goal of the DSM is to give a definition for those 400 disorders. Um, it's hard to be consistent. It is hard for different people to look at a psychological disorder and go through and say like it's that. It's kind of like going in with chest pain and you go to, you know, like a heart doctor and he's going to say that you have a heart problem with just looking at the symptoms. If you go into a lung doctor, they're going to say you have, lung problems. And if you go into a kidney doctor, they're going to say it's probably caused by your kidney somehow. It's just the way it is. And so it's hard, like same symptoms, hard to come to like a consistent interpretation. And that's what the DSM struggles with. So the problem with labeling something or diagnosing somebody as having a psychological disorder is you lose the fact that they are all individuals. You know, if I was depressed, my depression would look very different from your depression or somebody else's depression. Um, it can stigmatize them. It is very helpful when you give somebody a diagnosis though and say like you have depression. That person can go to somebody else and say like I'm depressed, and we understand that, so it makes it easy to communicate. So there are pros and cons of diagnosing people with psychological disorders. It makes it easy for us to communicate, but it also can hurt people. And so when you look at normal, and what is a normal person, by the way, that's me in college, and that's me my freshman year of high school before homecoming. Like normal people, it's such a weird term because what is normal? You know, is it normal to wear, you know, a helmet and shin guards and catch a ball that somebody hurls at you? Like, if you think about it in terms of a normal day, like, no, that is not normal. That's weird. But when you're playing baseball, that's normal. And so you have to have the context for all of these things. And when you look at somebody as normal, for the most part, like no one is normal. We are all weird in some way, shape, or form. And as soon as you can identify that and start moving past that and looking at how their brain is working, you can help them. So part of this too is this societal view of insanity. What does that mean? Like, what happens when somebody is insane? Like, what are they responsible for? Who is responsible for them? How does that going to look? You know, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was crazy. Is that his fault that he was doing those things? If he's insane, can he be held responsible for what he did? Um, what you're going to do for Friday is I want you to type up a little bit and say like, how do you think people should be treated if they are certifiably insane? Do you think there should be an insanity plea? If somebody has committed a violent crime, should they be able to get off and not have to go to jail for life or possibly get the death sentence? Um, if that person doesn't, should the doctors or their caretakers be held responsible? Um, so you're just going to type that up in a Google Doc and submit that for Friday. As we go forward, we'll start going through different individual psychological disorders. Make sure, guys, that you're watching the videos, you take the quiz after this, and you complete this assignment. If not, I will talk to you guys later. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or set up a Zoom or whatever. I'm happy to help.